So on behalf of the Kensington Library, I'd like to welcome Kurk Dorsey tonight. Kurk has taught U.S. environmental history and U.S. diplomatic history since 1994 at UNH, where he has won a Teaching Excellence Award and a Graduate Student Mentoring Award. He's published 2 books, The Dawn of Conservation Diplomacy and Whales and Nations, both in the Weyerhaeuser Environmental Book Series from the University of Washington Press. He has a PhD in history from Yale, an MA in history from Northwestern, and a double BA, I guess, or maybe consecutive BA in history and biology from Cornell. Tonight, Kurk will explain the sources and the history of the Russian war against Ukraine. It seems every day we read about another heartbreaking and terrifying story that comes out about Ukraine. So I think this is a wonderful topic to discuss tonight, especially as we approach the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you have questions, Kurk would be happy to take them during the event so you don't forget them. You can either put them in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and ask them. Or if you want to wait till the end, you can do the same thing, put them in the chat. I will monitor the chat and read them out loud. Or you can just raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask him a question. So I will turn it over to Kurk.
All right. Thank you very much, Susan. If you see me peering off to the side, I realize I have 2 screens. I should be looking at the green dot, but your faces are over here. So my instinct is to look over to the right, but I know I should look at the green dot. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you for the invitation, Susan. And I also thank you for the foresight to suggest doing this on Zoom, since I think it'll be snowing by the time this is over. And I'm only a couple of miles from my house, but still, I'm glad I'm not trying to drive back from Kensington if it actually starts snowing, sleeting, and what else it's going to do tonight. I mean, this is a remarkable time. Just a year ago at this point, as I saw somebody pointed out on the web today, the United States was desperately trying to warn the world that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. And a lot of people, including a lot of people in Ukraine, didn't want to hear it because they didn't want to hear that they might be the victims of a war. And a lot of people didn't want to even believe that it was possible that Russia would simply invade Ukraine over this made up charge that Ukraine was somehow a Nazi state. So it's interesting to go back a year and when we didn't realize what was going to happen, but there was a lot of fear, and to see what has come true and what has not come true. Of course, one of the things that did not come true was a lot of people assumed that Ukraine would not be able to stand against Russia for very long because we thought the Russian military was so large and so modern. And of course, that has turned out not to be true. But I will say my colleague, Kathy Frierson, who's a retired historian of Russia, when it first broke out in late February, we were exchanging emails, and she said, I think it's going to be a 2 or 3 year process, a long grind before we even know what's going to happen. And so we may have another year or 2 of something similar to what's going on now. So as Susan said, I'm happy to take questions in the middle. Feel free just to pipe up, or if I see hands over here on my right-hand side. But if I don't see you, don't think I'm ignoring you. Feel free to ask questions. I have the map of Europe here first for a couple of reasons, just because even though a lot of us have become sort of experts, and a lot of new Twitter experts on Ukraine in the last year who probably couldn't find Ukraine on a map in January of 2022, it is remarkable just to look at Ukraine's position in the world and how it straddles from Poland to Russia, but also borders Belarus. And I think Belarus is a really important part of the story to explain how we got to this position where Vladimir Putin felt this, the need to declare war, a special military operation, but he basically declared war on Ukraine. So I think Belarus is really going to be critical to this story. Now, there we go. The big question that we all face as we try to figure out what's going on in this war is, what are Vladimir Putin's goals? And on one hand, there is a very clear idea that Putin is upset, and many of Putin's defenders or apologists will say that the United States and its Western allies pushed NATO right up to the boundary of Russia, and what was Russia supposed to do but respond when it felt threatened? And so for them, this picture of the fist bump between President Zelensky of Ukraine and Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg of NATO is symbolic of this growing relationship between Ukraine and Ukraine and NATO that was a threat to Russia. And so there are a lot of people, and I think particularly people who are more sympathetic to Putin, who say that it was the rise of the NATO's influence and the EU's influence that caused Putin to act. The picture below of President Putin shaking hands with the Belarusian President Lukashenko, I think is more relevant. If you remember back 13 months ago, early in 2022, before it was apparent that there would be a Russian invasion, or at least a serious Russian threat to Ukraine, our big news from that part of the world was that the Belarusian government had forced down a commercial jetliner with a fake story that there was a bomb on the plane. And they did it so that they could take a Belarusian dissident and his girlfriend off the plane and arrest them. And this was shocking to the world. Since World War II, and the sort of the commercial aviation had been codified into a treaty, and it was just not acceptable for countries to force airliners down to take civilians off of them. And so what Lukashenko had done there was really shocking. There were a lot of protests and a lot of questions about what could be done to punish him for that. And it seems to me that the real goal that Vladimir Putin wants is that he wants Zelensky to be Lukashenko. He wants Zelensky to be basically a lapdog like Lukashenko is for Putin. And we've seen some of this. You know, there was a famous hockey game a couple of years ago where Putin and Lukashenko were on the ice together. And, Lukashenko could clearly check Putin against the boards if he really wanted to, but instead he was very deferential. And Belarus is a country that is very deferential to Russia across the board. Ukraine is a country that's, particularly since 2014, has been less and less deferential. And I think that ultimately has been the reason why Vladimir Putin has decided he needed to destroy Zelensky's government, because he ran the risk of losing any influence in Ukraine. The third piece I put up here on the slide is from a human rights organization called Memorial. And Memorial has a really interesting history. It started in the 1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev, when Gorbachev, as the last communist leader of the Soviet Union, unleashed a series of reforms meant to try to bring the Soviet Union up to speed with the rest of the world. And one of the things that cropped up in response to his efforts was this human rights organization known simply as Memorial. And as the name implies, part of its job was to memorialize all the people who had suffered under the Soviet Union, particularly under Joseph Stalin. But Memorial grew from that, and it grew into a civil rights organization and a human rights organization. And Gorbachev tolerated it, and certainly the Russian leadership after the collapse of the Soviet Union tolerated Memorial, sometimes encouraged it. There were certainly good reasons to encourage blaming communist leaders for the past and therefore for some of the problems of the present. But Vladimir Putin has never liked Memorial. He doesn't like a human rights organization. He doesn't like one that's going back to unearth the problems of the Soviet Union for a variety of reasons I'll talk about later. And so Putin has been at war with Memorial since he took power. And in December of 2021, he finally succeeded in shutting down Memorial completely. And I remember when that happened thinking, I wonder why this is happening now. And then 6 weeks later, he invaded Ukraine. It's like, oh, that's why it was happening in December. He wanted to get rid of one of these last really successful counterweights to his regime, because Memorial was free from his influence. So the fact that he shut down the main civil rights, human rights opposition organization in his country shortly before the invasion suggested he knew this was going to be potentially an unpopular war, and he wanted to get rid of a source of opposition. You probably also are aware of Alexei Navalny, who's been thrown in jail, and Putin has tried to assassinate him more times than the Coyotes tried to kill the Roadrunner without success. But he has him in jail right now. And again, he's been trying to get rid of any source of opposition at home. Putin has pretty consistently pushed this idea of denazification. In fact, even in his speech, I guess it was 2 days ago now, he still referred to the Nazi government in Kyiv, which is just, I mean, it's remarkable. If there was a marketing major anywhere close to him, he'd say, Vladimir, that is not working. You're not convincing anybody that the regime is Nazi in Ukraine. And of course, the first problem with the whole idea that the Ukrainian regime is Nazi is that the president, Zelensky, is himself Jewish. So it seems highly unlikely that he would also be a Nazi or be covering for Nazis. But there are a couple things going on here with the denazification idea. First of all, there is this complex history with Stepan Bandera. Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist who fought for pretty much every side during World War II as he was trying to figure out how to free Ukraine from Soviet influence. There's no doubt that Bandera was an anti-Semite and he cooperated with the Nazis. And the Ukrainian government has celebrated him from time to time, including, as you can see on the screen, putting out an official postage stamp for him. And it's not accidental that the Russian officials have occasionally referred to the Ukrainian government as Banderites, trying to play on this idea that Bandera is still alive, although he does look a little bit like Voldemort from the movie. So I guess there's maybe some connection there. Of course, the other thing going on with the denazification is that it's a way for Putin to connect back to the greatest moment in 20th century Russian history, which was when the Soviet army finally defeated Nazi armies in Eastern Europe. So I've got this picture from May 1945, and these are Soviet soldiers holding a rank of high value flags from division. So you see the one right there in the front, I believe it says Adolf Hitler on it. But these are divisional flags from the divisions that the Nazis had put together that the Red Army had vanquished. So by trying to echo back to this idea that they were going to denazify Eastern Europe, it was calling on the best of the Russians of the 20th century, what they had done that was more valuable than anybody else for humanity. And they pushed this one so hard that one of the most devastating tweets I think I've ever seen, the Russian embassies around the world have really been pushing, not surprisingly, the Russian government line, and including the Russian embassy in South Africa. They pushed this idea of denazifying Ukraine. And the German embassy in South Africa had enough. And as they put in their own tweet, this was back shortly after the war started, we can't be silent on this one. Russia is slaughtering Ukrainian women and children for its own gain. It's not Nazism, and sadly, we're kind of experts on Nazism. So the German government has been pushing back, and I think in some ways the denazification idea was it was a bad move just because it was completely inaccurate. But also, I think it is caused the Germans to rethink some of their policies in Eastern Europe. One of the ideas that the Germans didn't want to see any German tanks in Eastern Europe for obvious reasons. But eventually now they've come around to being willing to let Leopard tanks, which are German tanks, into Eastern Europe to fight for the Russians, or fight against the Russians, I think because what Putin has done is sort of rub their noses in their Nazi history, and they have to somehow keep making up for that. That's a completely different story of German history. So I want to go back into the background of how we got into this position, in particular, why the United States finds it even cares about Ukraine, because 100 years ago, Americans didn't really care about Ukraine, including the government. So if we go back to 1919, here's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was president during World War I. He had laid out in 1918 during the war what he called the 14 points. It was his plan for peace. And one of the key parts of the 14 points was that nations would have self-determination based on national identity. There's a complex history of what happens with that, but people around the world read Wilson's words, and one of the things they conclude is that the United States supports the idea of independent countries based on nationality all over the world. In the abstract, that was true. In the direct sense that Wilson could do anything about it, it was not true. But it's not accidental that when the Russian Empire collapses at the end of World War I, there is briefly in 1919 an independent Ukrainian state, and the Ukrainians expect help from the United States. Woodrow Wilson is in no position to offer it, and that Ukrainian state dissolves itself into war and eventually is absorbed into the Soviet Union. But Americans have forgotten that there ever was an independent Ukraine in the 20th century, but early 20th century. But Ukrainians remember it well. And they remember this idea that Wilson had laid out, this liberal international order that the United States stood for, but then backed away from. But the liberal international order obviously did not die in 1919 when Woodrow Wilson decided he didn't really mean Ukraine as an independent country, because it got started up again during and immediately after World War II. So I'm sure some of you have been up to the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. And if you've been there, you've probably seen the Gold Room. The Gold Room is still in place, preserved largely as it was in 1944, when it was the site of a meeting among all the Allied nations to set up an economic system of cooperation in the world. So this is the most famous picture on the, I guess it's the right, my right at least, John Maynard Keynes talking to Harry Dexter White, two prominent economists and from Britain and the United States, and they organized a world economic system with the idea that World War II had been caused by economic competition. So they were going to try to prevent wars by creating economic cooperation. The Bretton Woods Agreement is hugely important. We cannot overstate the significance of the nations of the world working out their economic problems in the middle of a war, creating organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, which for all their flaws were important for helping contribute to 25 years of sustained prosperity after World War II. So that was the economic foundation of this new international order, but there was also a political foundation, which included the United Nations, but more importantly, I think, included Harry Truman in 1947. You see him speaking to Congress. In 1947, Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was pretty straightforward. The United States saw the world in basically black and white terms. There were free countries and there were unfree countries. And it was the American obligation to help organize the free countries to withstand totalitarian government, by which he meant Joseph Stalin. And this played out in all sorts of alliances around the world, some very successful, like NATO, others not so successful, like the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, that was supposed to defend Vietnam and obviously did not succeed. But still, the United States had basically staked itself on leading all the countries in the world that could be considered free. And there was a pretty loose definition of what free meant. It included Turkey and Greece and some countries in South America that had never had an election. Free was basically not communist. But it organized all these countries first into the UN, with obviously communist membership, into things like NATO. And the idea emerged out of the war that we were going to not accept conquest of other countries anymore. That was a thing of the past. So that liberal internationalist order, with the rise of the UN, every member state of the UN agrees when it signs on to the UN. Article 2 of the Charter of the UN says that you will not use force against another member of the UN. That you will resolve your differences peacefully. And that's the first way in which Russia has violated its word by invading Ukraine. Russia immediately came into the UN when it broke out of the Soviet Union in 1991. It had been part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been part of the UN from the beginning as well. So the second major transition, to jump ahead in terms of the Russian promise to help maintain world order and not invade countries, came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So you probably all recognize Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, who helped create this new state, actually about 17 new states out of the Soviet Union. And you see the map here of all the different small states that broke out of the Soviet Union in 1991. Gorbachev, of course, had not intended to cause the Soviet Union to collapse. What he wanted was for the Soviet Union to reform itself along Western lines. But that, of course, did not work, because the first thing most people in the Soviet Union wanted was to get as far away from Moscow as possible. So all these states, some large, some small, like Kazakhstan and Ukraine, broke away, but also Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And the late 80s, early 90s was a time of great turmoil. But all of these states joined the UN, and therefore they all agreed that they would not solve their problems militarily. And then in 1994, the question of Ukrainian sovereignty and nuclear missiles became a very hot issue that had to be resolved. So the Soviet Union had the largest nuclear arsenal in history at that point, significantly larger than Russia's arsenal now or America's arsenal now. Those nuclear warheads were scattered across 4 of the countries, not just what became Russia, but also Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Now, for those 4 countries, on one hand, having the nuclear missiles in their territory was a mark of power and prestige. And so you see a picture of a Ukrainian-built missile, because some of these missiles were built in the Ukrainian territory during the Soviet Union period. But these missiles were also a hindrance. The command and control was still in Moscow. So it wasn't like Ukraine could just launch a missile at somebody. And the missiles also required a lot of maintenance. They were potentially vulnerable to terrorism. The Soviet states were bankrupt and they didn't want to try to guard these things. So in 1994, Presidents Clinton, Yeltsin, and Kravchuk, you see them in order here, met in Budapest along with John Major, the Prime Minister of Britain, and they made a solemn agreement that Ukraine would give away its missiles, give them back to Russia, And in exchange, Russia would recognize the boundaries of Ukraine as they were in 1994. And this was not a formal treaty. It was just an agreement because one of the reasons was that they didn't think they could get a treaty through the US Senate. But the United States, in effect, guaranteed this deal. And so you can see the handshake. It was a momentous moment because it brought all these nuclear warheads back to Russia. So there would just be one nuclear state rather than four. And also for Ukrainians, it recognized that they were a sovereign state separate from Russia so that Russia would not, under any circumstances, try to reclaim it. So that was the context in the mid-1990s when this question of NATO expansion came up, which I mentioned at the start of the talk. So you can see the original NATO nations are the black countries on this map. And NATO was founded in 1949. It was founded by 3 countries. And I often ask if I have a live audience, can you name the 3 countries? And we usually get France and Britain. The 3 countries who started NATO were Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, sometimes referred to as the Benelux countries, which of course always makes me think of a vacuum cleaner. But these are the 3 smallest states there in Western Europe. They had been invaded repeatedly, and they wanted to propose the idea of collective security. First, they would link themselves in the form of collective security. Then they would hopefully get France on board, and then Britain. And then if they got them, maybe they could get the United States to guarantee their boundaries. The core element of NATO is Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. So the Western Europeans organized themselves, and then they persuaded the United States and Canada to join. They also proved that they failed geography class because they got Italy to join an organization named after the North Atlantic. But that was, and then later they got Turkey, but in Greece, they sort of stretched the definition of the North Atlantic. And you can see in the map that many of the NATO countries are very close to Germany. And it's important to remember that in 1949, when those countries formed NATO, they were just as worried about German revenge as they were about a Soviet invasion. In fact, one joke was that the French liked NATO because it kept the Soviets out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. So after a few years, they decided that Germany, at least West Germany, was okay. It had reformed itself in 1955, so they brought it into NATO. They brought a few other countries, you can see, like Spain in 1982, but basically NATO stayed in its original borders until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and 90. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it took with it the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was an anti-NATO organization. You can see basically the countries in green on this map were parts of the Warsaw Pact. And as one person pointed out, I think this was again on Twitter, the Warsaw Pact is the only alliance in history that exclusively attacked its own members because they crushed Hungarian dissent, they crushed Czechoslovak dissent. They never actually fought anybody outside the borders of their own alliance. So the Warsaw Pact collapsed because no free government in Eastern Europe wanted to be part of it. And immediately, countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic wanted into NATO. There's a huge debate in the 1990s whether or not NATO should even exist. If the Soviet Union collapsed, why not just let NATO dissolve? Because what was the threat in Europe? And I remember we had a debate here in 1996 between a Harvard professor and the ambassador to the United States from Hungary. And the Harvard professor was saying, we shouldn't expand NATO. If anything, we should close it down. It's just antagonizing the Russians. And the Hungarian foreign minister, or ambassador, he later became foreign minister, he said, if you think Russia is not a long-term threat, you are not paying attention to history. Like, we want to get into NATO because we think Russia is down but not out, which is kind of ironic given Hungary's position now. But that was the position of Hungary in 1996. So the Hungarians, the Poles, and the Czechs were the first Eastern Europeans to come into NATO. And, Westerners understood that this was a challenge to Russia. I do want to point out one thing, because it's often, Putin and his apologists will often say this wasn't the case. But in the latest book about James Baker, the Secretary of State in the Bush administration, they recounts that Baker met Mikhail Gorbachev when East Germany was reuniting with West Germany. And one of the questions that came up was, could East Germany and united with West Germany be part of NATO? And Gorbachev was originally resistant to the idea, but Baker and George H.W. Bush said to him, well, you can't really tell a country, a free sovereign country, that it can't choose its own allies. And Gorbachev thought about that, and he said, well, I'm not entirely happy with East Germany being in NATO, but you're right. Once I allow East Germany to reintegrate with West Germany, which is as it should be, Gorbachev didn't oppose that, we can't tell the Germans who they can or can't ally with. And so countries are free to choose their alliances, even if that means it's an anti-Russian alliance. So the Soviets were on board with that. So you can see from the color of the map that 1999 was a big year, because that's when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary officially joined NATO at its 50th anniversary meeting. And so this was a moment when NATO made a decision that it would go east and it would take in countries that were part of the old Russian Empire. But the NATO leadership didn't do this blindly. They knew what they were doing. They understood that some Russians were unhappy. So they also instituted a program called Partnership for Peace. And the idea was that they would share most of NATO's secrets, maybe not its defense plans, but they would invite countries from throughout Europe that were not members of NATO to observe NATO exercises, to be represented at NATO headquarters, to try to be as open as possible. And you can see Russia was involved with that. The former states of the Soviet Union were all involved. Finland, Sweden, traditional neutrals like Switzerland and Ireland, all were willing to be part of the Partnership for Peace. So NATO tried its best to assuage fears of other countries that it was not an aggressive organization. And the idea that NATO is aggressive is laughable. Germany has the biggest army in NATO outside the United States, and Germany's army is consistently underfunded. In 2001, I was visiting some German friends, and I asked them about NATO expansion and what they thought about the role of the German army. And my friend said, well, you have to understand, Germany has a state-of-the-art army for 1968. So Germany was really not modernizing. There was no threat of invading to the east. It was countries from the east who were coming to the west, wanting to be part of what they had out west, what the West had. So that brings us then to Vladimir Putin, because Putin is, of course, the core of this whole story. Putin became president in 1999. He was appointed by Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had done his best to create a free and independent Russia with free elections and some sort of free enterprise. He had failed miserably for a lot of reasons. He pulled out of relative obscurity Vladimir Putin, who had been a former KGB officer and who was mainly known for sort of getting things done in St. Petersburg. But I don't know how much of Putin's soul Yeltsin really saw. And I use the soul line in part because George W. Bush, seen here at with a group of world leaders in 2005, was asked about Vladimir Putin, knowing that Putin was a former KGB officer. And George Bush said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and that he knew that they could cooperate. John McCain, who did not have a lot of use for George Bush, somebody asked him about that. He said, I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw a K, a G, and a B. He was still the KGB Soviet secret officer that he had always been. During the Bush administration, though, by the end of the administration, things were pretty tense between Russia and the United States for a number of reasons I can get into later. So the new Clinton administration, the new almost Clinton administration, the Obama administration, sent Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to meet the foreign minister Lavrov, who is an amazing survivor because he's still the foreign minister of Russia. And you may remember she brought a reset button. They were going to reset our relations with Russia because Russia was too important to have on the outs. But Vladimir Putin never really, I think, changed his ideas, which were that the old Soviet Union had actually worked pretty well. Russia had been humiliated by the West, and the West wasn't going to treat it, was never really going to have a reset. And so he was looking for ways to minimize Russian influence in his country. So that brings us to Ukraine in particular. So Ukraine is a fascinating country. Of course, many Americans are still calling it the Ukraine because of what we know from its history, or maybe we know that it's a piece on the map of the risk board. Certainly before the last year, Ukraine was not well known to Americans. But Ukraine was a country that was really oscillating between the West and the East ever since its independence in 1991. Pretty early on, it shook off the old communist one-party state and created a new constitution with elections. And There was some serious protests. There was a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and there was a lot of desire in Ukraine, particularly among young people, to tie themselves more to the European Union and the West. And this particularly became a major issue in 2013 and 2014. So the president at the time was Viktor Yanukovych, you see in the middle. He was clearly pro-Russian. He was pretty openly pro-Russian. He thought Ukraine should be tied more closely to Russia than to the West. And in a particular moment, he pulled Ukraine out of negotiations for a treaty that would have tied the Ukrainian economy to the European Union. And I have no doubt that Vladimir Putin told him, I don't want this deal. And Yanukovych, knowing which side of where his bread was buttered, said, okay, I'm going to pull out of this. And that launched this huge wave of protests, particularly in downtown Kyiv, which was known as the Euromaidan protests. And I picked this particular picture because you can see the protester holding a sign: "We support European values, freedom, democracy, and human rights and justice." And first of all, it's striking that these are European values. These are not Ukrainian values. These are European, like everybody in Europe should share these. Of course, it's also striking they're in English, right? Because this is clearly sending a message outside of Ukraine that the protesters in the streets wanted to have a relationship with the rest of the world, different from what Yanukovych wanted. And there were serious crackdowns. Probably 100 people were killed by the Ukrainian police services, sometimes secret services, who were acting on Yanukovych's orders. Finally, Yanukovych recognized that his rule was unsustainable and he was going to have to leave the country. So he fled the country, taking a sizable portion of the Ukrainian treasury with him. And in new elections, a pro-Western candidate, Petro Poroshenko, was elected, and Ukraine began the slow process of moving towards the West under Poroshenko's lead. But of course, that was not acceptable to Vladimir Putin. And it's not accidental that 2014 was also the time, really, when the war between Ukraine and Russia started. So this map with of the different colors is striking. This was before 2014. What percentage of the people in each of the oblasts or sort of provinces of Ukraine spoke Russian? And I must admit, I don't know whether it spoke Russian as a first language or spoke Russian at all, but you can see clearly there's a pattern that down in the Crimean Peninsula, 3/4 of the people speak Russian. In a couple of the eastern provinces, it's also, 2/3 to 3/4. And then as you go further west in Ukraine, almost nobody speaks Russian. And this is, I think we're going to have to use a useful proxy for whether or not there was sympathy towards Russia in Ukraine. And it seems pretty clearly from election results that Eastern Ukrainians were more likely to support a guy like Yanukovych, a pro-Russian guy, and Western Ukrainians were more likely to support Poroshenko. So there was sort of a split in the country. Now you see also the Crimean Peninsula, and Vladimir Putin started making the point that Crimea had always been Russian, and it had just been taken away by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s, so it belonged back in Russia. Of course, the Budapest Agreement for 1994 didn't care about that. It said Crimea is part of Ukraine and Russia recognizes that. So in 1994, the Ukrainian government found itself under attack by their, what we were calling at the time, little green men. They were clearly Russian soldiers, but they weren't wearing Russian insignia. And they carved Crimea off from the rest of Ukraine and then started a civil war in the eastern provinces. And then eventually held a referendum in Crimea, which was completely crooked, that claimed that the Crimeans wanted to be part of Russia. Nobody else in the world recognized that. If you look on the map, you see obviously Crimea, the striped part, the part that the Russians have officially annexed. And then you see the Donbass region, as we call it broadly, in the middle of the map, the sort of yellow striped. Those are the regions that have had basically a long-running civil war. We're coming in on almost a decade of civil war there between pro-Russian forces and pro-Kiev forces. I think it's worth noting that it was out of the Donbass region where a Buk missile was fired at the Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Ukraine, killing a couple hundred people. And only recently, the Dutch government basically said that Vladimir Putin was responsible for sending that unit in. And in addition, at the speech yesterday I read, or 2 days ago, I read that he gave a medal to the unit that fired that missile that shot down the airplane. Now, that was 9 years ago, but it's kind of striking to give them a medal, given that they shot down a civilian airliner and pretty clearly recognized that they had shot down a civilian airliner. So the Donbass region has been in civil war for close to a decade. It was very intense in 2014, and the civil war had died down by 2022. so that there are still casualties, but it was not nearly as hot as it had been in 2014. So that was the start of Russian aggression against Ukrainian sovereignty. So Ukraine responded. It wasn't really ready in 2014 to fight a full-on war with Russia, so a couple things happened. For one thing, Ukraine reached out to get more and more training, particularly from the United States. Now, Americans have been training Ukrainian military officials for a while, but this in particular became more intense, and a number of American soldiers were serving in Ukraine right up to the end of 2021, helping create a new Ukrainian army that was not in the Russian model. And by all accounts, that succeeded in creating an army that had NATO-style tactics. If you were in NATO since 1949, you recognize that what was likely to happen was that the Russian army was going to send a huge tank column at you, and you couldn't defeat the tank column. What you could is let the tanks go by you and then destroy the logistics column, and that would pretty much kill the tanks. And this is what the Ukrainians did in the first few weeks of their fight against the Russians. So they were pretty effectively trained. They picked up their lessons pretty well. Of course, also, under the Obama administration, Ukraine had been getting a lot of non-lethal aid. Congress moved under the Trump administration to offer lethal aid, including anti-tank weapons, which the Ukrainians had been asking for since 2014. And the Obama administration had been reluctant to escalate the war in Ukraine and had not given them. So Congress did authorize that. And of course, this is where the first Trump impeachment came from, where Trump called President Zelensky and said, I'll release those anti-tank weapons, but first I want you to do me a favor, right? This is, in his telling, a perfect phone call. In the telling of some of the people who were listening, it was basically a form of blackmail. Eventually, the Ukrainian government did get the weapons that Congress had voted for it, and those were pretty useful, certainly at the start of this war in 2022. But it still raises the question of what Putin was thinking in early 2022, why he would make such a dangerous decision to launch a war that clearly has gone really badly. And a couple of things, as I was watching in 2021, 2022, one thing I noticed right away was that Vladimir Putin, who is obviously very scared of getting COVID and doesn't trust, I'm sure he's had a Western vaccine, not the Russian vaccine, would not meet closely in terms of physical proximity with anybody. And there was this famous National Security Council meeting in February of 2022, which they televised. And this is just so telling, Putin sitting at his desk, and it looks like sometimes the Catholic masses I go to, we're all sitting in the back as far from the priest as possible in case he sees us. They're all really distant from him. He doesn't want to be close to them. And that symbolizes a distance. He doesn't have anybody who he really trusts up close. Why are those people at a distance? Because he's not sure if they have COVID. He doesn't trust them. And they televised parts of this discussion that he framed it as, how they were going to handle Ukraine. And there was this one particular moment that I thought was really striking. So the man on the right, upper right, Sergei Naryshkin, was sort of like the head of the CIA for Russia. He came to the podium, like all the other members of Putin's National Security Council, to say what they thought about relations with the West and the potential to invade Ukraine. And most of the people got up and said, well, you're the smartest man in the world, Vladimir. We should do whatever you want to do. Naryshkin had the gumption to say, I don't think we're really ready for this war, and I think we should try diplomacy with the West one more time. He wasn't blaming Putin. He wasn't anti-Russian. He just said, maybe we should pump the brakes a little bit on the war. And Putin just eviscerated him in public. And so I'm sure Naryshkin went back to his apartment and stayed way far away from the windows. If you follow David Frum, the intellectual, sort of conservative intellectual, he had a good line. If he ever gets into a hospital in Moscow, he's going to pay extra for a first floor room because all these anti-Putin people keep falling out of windows around the world. So I'm sure Naryshkin didn't go anywhere close to a window after that because Putin did not want to hear anything about negotiating with the West. And what that reminded me of was George Kennan. You see him in the lower left-hand corner, who was an American diplomat in Moscow in 1946. And there was a big kerfuffle between the United States and Stalin, and it was a question of what was going to happen. And so the United States asked Kennan, could you please explain what's happening in Russia? And he typed out the long telegram, 8,000 words. But there's this one line in particular that it struck me watching Putin not listen to any of his advisors, or maybe better yet, only listening to advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. And Kennan wrote, I, for one, am reluctant to believe that Stalin himself receives anything like an objective picture of the outside world. And I think that's part of what's going on here. I think Putin has insulated himself from anybody who can tell him you're wrong. And that's a terrible place for a leader to put himself, but he put himself there. And so I think he believed that the Ukrainian people would not put up much of a fight. And I think he believed that Zelensky was a threat to him who had to be removed. The West had made clear before the war started that there were going to be serious sanctions if the war started. And you can see on the chart on the bottom what happened to the ruble when the West slapped sanctions on as the war started. The ruble basically became a piece of paper, like almost no value, more than 120 rubles to the euro. And now eventually that has stabilized at a much lower rate. But ever since the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008, you can see the Western sanctions have been slowly clamping down on the value of the ruble. Now, part of the reason why governments put sanctions in place is that they want to create pressure internally. Sanctions don't hurt the people at the top. If you have 5 billion euros stashed in a bank in Switzerland, and there are sanctions that reduce you by 4 billion euros, you're still a billionaire. You can still live the life you want and send your kids to the West while you rail against the West, as so many of these Russian leaders do. Where the sanctions are really going to hurt are the people who don't have any savings. When the ruble tanks and they've got 5,000 rubles in the bank, and suddenly they're worth about 100 euros rather than 300 euros, their value, their money has gone down dramatically. So my political science friends tell me, oh, sanctions work a couple of times in history. I don't buy it. Sanctions don't work. Sanctions are a way of saying, we're really angry. Don't force us to do something more severe. And maybe we'll try to start a revolution in your country. And we saw early on some really brave people protesting the war. And usually those videos ended with police officers beating them up and arresting them. So the anti-war protests in Russia didn't develop into much. They started, they were quashed, and now people will have to be really brave to push back against Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. All right, good. So the map is changing. So this is a map courtesy of Wikipedia showing what happened in the first month or so of the war. And you can see how the Russian forces did what most people expected. They took huge portions of Ukraine. And then as the war went on, the Russian army turned out to be a lot more hollow than anybody expected. And pretty soon the Ukrainians were pushing the Russians back, particularly in the north. Kyiv did not fall in 3 days. Kyiv survived. And now it's a pretty stable place, relatively speaking. The UN responded to the Russian invasion by trying to have a statement against the war. Of course, they couldn't use the Security Council because Russia has the veto in the Security Council. So Russia would just veto anything that was pushed against it. So they went to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly voted overwhelmingly. You see the green states all voted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The sort of brick red states like Syria and Eritrea, which are Russian allies, North Korea, voted in favor of Russia's invasion. And the yellow states were the ones that basically abstained. So a lot of the European states, the African states didn't want to get involved in condemning this Russian invasion because they had too much at stake in cooperating with Russia. So as the war has expanded, there's been a war for the hearts and minds. Vladimir Zelensky has really risen to the occasion. You can tell at some levels that he was an actor, somebody very comfortable in front of a camera. When he spoke to British Parliament, he invoked Winston Churchill. When he spoke to the American Congress, he invoked Martin Luther King. And so he's done a brilliant job, as has the whole Ukrainian government, of making the Ukrainians clearly the good guys who are just being victimized. If I see another video of a Ukrainian soldier adopting a puppy or a kitten, even I may get tired of them. There's so many of them. They've just done this brilliant job of look how humane we are compared to the Russians. And of course, they're getting a huge assist from the Russians who keep blowing up train stations and apartment buildings. But even as they do that, Vladimir Putin has been working hard to shore up alliances with some people. So he had this conference in September of 2022, and you see some of the people who were there at this conference with him. The Shanghai Cooperation. There's the President Xi of China and Premier Modi of India, and then some of the people of the other Central Asian states. But the key thing is India and China were willing to appear on the same stage with Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that Putin was blowing up cities with missiles and not really being very apologetic for it. Of course, if you've been following the news, you know that the United States just sent a very stern warning to President Xi not to support Russia's war effort by sending in military equipment. We'll see what happens with that. The analysts I follow say that the tone of the American warning was such that it suggests that they think the Chinese have already committed to sending these weapons. And of course, that would be a game changer if the Chinese decided they wanted to keep the Russians fighting by supplying them weapons that the Russians can't build because of their sanctions. So we're now in sort of a position of stalemate, and it'll be an interesting question to see how long this lasts. Another one of the Wikipedia maps showing change over time. And of course, one of the things it shows in the fall of 2022 is there really wasn't a lot of change. The Russians still hold large portions of eastern and southern Ukraine. It doesn't seem like the Ukrainian army currently has the ability to push those people out, those soldiers out. There's still a lot of territory. Of course, there's been a lot of talk recently about giving particularly Leopard tanks from Germany, but maybe some American M1 tanks as well. These would be very effective in launching offensives, but we're still talking about a huge amount of territory that has to be reclaimed and not a lot of tanks. So it seems like the war has reached some level of stalemate right now. And this is the question in the United States is, do we think it's a good investment to sustain the level of support that the United States has given? It's closing in on $30 billion worth of support. I just read in the paper yesterday that Japan has pledged $5.5 billion worth of support. And of course, this is just to keep Ukraine fighting. How much is it going to take to rebuild all those places that were destroyed in the war? We're probably talking hundreds of billions of dollars. And there's a question of what is it worth? I'll just say one thing as I wrap up here. People wonder, like, how is this going to end? And it's hard for me to see a diplomatic solution. I don't think any Ukrainian government can sign a deal that leaves Russian troops anywhere in Ukraine that was taken since 2014. I don't think the Ukrainian government can accept that, not in the near future. And Vladimir Putin can't negotiate a deal, it seems to me, that recognizes that he lost. So there's going to have to be some major battlefield shifts before we get a diplomatic solution. And so far, the United States position has been no settlement without Ukraine's endorsement. I think that will last for some time. And so we'll find out in the spring whether or not this new infusion of armor and other weapons is enough to change the balance of power in eastern Ukraine. So I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I may turn off the PowerPoint so I can see you all better. But thank you. I'm open for any questions.
I have one. I'll start and then I'll let others. You said in the beginning, will Putin wait 2 years? I mean, you said this might take 2 years. When he had his talk the other night, his very long talk, and it seemed like everybody was cheering him on.
Right.
He wants to pull back from the START treaty, which to me means he might try nuclear weapons to get this war over before. I mean, is that a strong possibility?
So I'd say, first of all, in terms of the START treaty, the main thing about the START treaty as it's as the current one, which the first one was negotiated in 1991, so there's a long history there. It's been renegotiated a couple of times. The key thing about the START treaty is that there is open inspection that both countries have on the other country's territory. So by pulling out of the START treaty, he's going to prevent American military officials from going over and inspecting Russian nuclear bases. And this is called the Open Skies Agreement as part of the START agreement, that both countries can do this. So I think the immediate thing is he doesn't want Westerners poking around seeing the state of his military, and this is one way to prevent that. The other thing, of course, is it limits the number of nuclear warheads that are sort of an active status and total that each country can have. Given the state of the Russian economy and the fact that they can't even build enough weapons, that they're importing drones from Iran, I don't see them building more nuclear weapons anytime soon. So I don't know that the withdrawal from the START treaty is going to change his calculus for using nuclear weapons, but it may be, but I think it's more a way of showing the West, you still need us you still need our cooperation for some things. And you are going to pay a price for helping Ukraine, and we're going to start making clear what that price is. They tried earlier, of course, with natural gas, and that didn't work out particularly well. So now they're going to try to find other ways to pressure the West and say, you don't want us to go down this path where we're not even talking to each other.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Does anybody else have any questions? You can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. Come on, you must have questions.
Kirk, do you have any sense who will win the war, and why do you think they'll be the winner? It may be too far in the distant and future to ask, but I'll ask it anyways.
No. I mean, it's the ultimate question, right? It's just who will win and when. I don't see any circumstances under which we will be looking back in the future and saying Russia won this war. Even if Russia were to somehow decide that a nuclear weapon on Kyiv or something like that was a good idea and force a diplomatic solution that favors Russia, the losses to Russia so far for the territory they have sort of gained control of is such that there's no way to say the Russians won. And Russia has basically used the best part of its army. So it can continue to pound Ukrainian cities for a while. But I think the most that Russia could ever get out of that is if the Ukrainians say, after a year or two more of this, okay, we're not going to actually push them out of the territory that they took since 2014. And for whatever reason, we just need to negotiate whatever kind of peace we can get. And so, I guess Vladimir Putin could call that a win, but the rest of the world would say, given what Russia's costs have been, that wouldn't be a win. I think more likely is that somebody in Russia will kill Vladimir Putin and then negotiate a settlement that gets them out of Ukraine, but without having to pay any reparations for all the damage they've done. I am very hesitant to see a scenario where the Ukrainian army can successfully push the Russians out of all that territory and then negotiate some sort of settlement with Putin. I think that would be the end of Vladimir Putin. One of the things that Putin has done is he's backed himself into a corner where he really has no choice but to keep going with the war. Because he staked all his prestige on it. And he can't even flee the country because there are like 44 million Ukrainians who would hunt him down and kill him in a heartbeat. So I think he's in a position where he's hanging on to power. He is trying whatever he can to disrupt potential centers of opposition, hence the breakdown of Memorial, the way he's like abused the Wagner group. That was a potential army that might come against him, but basically he's been letting them get slaughtered. I think right now he's as much worried about internal opposition as he is Ukrainian government. So a Ukrainian victory, but at a huge cost. And it's only going to be Ukrainian victory, to be blunt, if the West comes forward with an enormous amount of aid to help rebuild Ukraine.
Do you think it's in the interest of China, Iran, and North Korea to help Russia to keep the United States and NATO involved in Ukraine? I mean, I really think that you are right, that China is going to send lethal weapons. Their logistics are right on the border. Yep. The North Koreans have logistics right on the border, and Ukraine and Iran doesn't seem to have any problem getting drones over there.
Right, because they are very close as well. So, in fact, I think they still share a border with, I guess not with Russia anymore. With all three of those countries, it is a challenge to see what their logical foreign policy is in this particular case. And in each of those three countries, a core part of their foreign policy is to be opposed to the United States, just viscerally. Like, obviously, Iran can't do anything to cooperate with the United States, particularly after the Iran nuclear deal from 2015 fell apart when Trump took the United States out of it. And Biden has not really done a lot to get back into it. I think the Iranians expected Biden to bend over backwards to get back in, and he hasn't. So I think there's an element in all three of those countries. It's just whatever the United States is doing, we're going to do the opposite. Now, North Korea is not rational the way the rest of the world sees rationality. I don't want to say North Koreans are irrational, but we don't obviously see the world in the same way. I would say the Iranian government also, the Iranian government has done the remarkable trick of making the Saudi Arabians trust Israel more than a Muslim country. I don't think the Iranians are particularly making wise calculations either. The Chinese question is really tricky to figure out what game they're playing here. my sense of what China is doing is that, China and Russia have been rivals for centuries. The idea that there's a natural alliance between them, which, the West feared in the Cold War, was kind of goofy. Like they hate each other more than they like each other. I think what Xi Jinping is doing is, I think he's waited for Putin to get desperate. Putin is certainly desperate right now. And now he's got Putin right where he wants him, and basically can say to the Russians, well, what's it worth to get this flow of weapons and to have us trade for your oil that you can't sell anywhere else in the world, and sell you manufactured goods you can't build. I think that the irony is that Putin started the war hoping to push Ukraine into vassal state status. And what he's done is make himself awfully close to a vassal state of China. Now, he's still got 6,000 nuclear warheads. So, I mean, it's not obviously a complete vassal state, but he needs China a lot more than China needs him. And I think Xi Jinping is loving it. I think he's thinking, the consequences of sending some weapons to the Russians, we're not going to start a war with them. So the consequences are small. We already are mad about the balloons and all these other things flying over and all our rivalry with China. Like, that's not really going to change U.S.-Chinese relations. So given all that, I think Xi Jinping figures he's got a no-lose proposition. He makes Vladimir Putin owe him something. So he annoys the United States. We're already annoyed. I think he thinks he can calibrate this. The other thing I'll say about Xi Jinping is he's got a little bit of the Vladimir Putin going on, where he's not getting a picture of the world. I don't think there are a lot of people in China who can tell Xi Jinping, the emperor has no clothes. You may have heard some of these things recently. I forget who the leader was, who he pulled out of the Congress, the former premier of China. He pulled him out of the party Congress publicly. Like, I'm not even going to risk having you be an opponent. I'm just going to humiliate you. There's this whole thing in China where, people have started comparing him to Winnie the Pooh, and he's like trying to crack down on that because he can't take, these sort of little pushing insults. I think we're going to find out that Xi Jinping has got a lot of the Vladimir Putin in him. He just has a more efficient country around him than Putin.
There's a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just saw that Wayne had his hand up for a while, but I can also take questions from the chat, whichever you want, Susan.
Why don't you take the one that's raised first? I didn't see that.
Yeah, no, this is an open-ended question. And so I talk to a lot of folks about this and try to learn the most. What do you say to folks that say that Zelensky was propped up by the West? From what I can tell, right, he overwhelmingly won the election. Overwhelmingly. Yeah,
so Zelensky is a fascinating guy because, on one hand, he won the election overwhelmingly, but then in January of 2022 or December of 2021, his approval rating was in the tank. I mean, he was not a popular president. But then his leadership since then has rallied the Ukrainian people. I mean, his approval ratings are probably some of the highest in the world of an actual elected leader, as opposed to, the North Korean leader's approval rating, I'm sure, is 100% if you were to poll North Koreans. So I wouldn't say he was propped up in the sense that the West had been providing military equipment since 2014, sometimes lethal and sometimes non-lethal. And certainly the West, after seeing that he wasn't going to flee Kyiv and that Kyiv wasn't going to fall in 3 days, started pouring in resources. So yeah, he was propped up, but in the same way that Britain was propped up in 1940 by Lend-Lease. So the United States made a bipartisan decision that it was in the American government's interest and the American people's interest to protect a democratically elected leader and to withstand Russian aggression. So yeah, I think we propped him up, but I think he wouldn't be in place still if the Ukrainian people didn't value his leadership. There's going to be a lot of criticism because a year ago, when the United States was saying the Russians are about to invade, people like Zelensky were saying, no, they're not going to. And then they said after the invasion, well, we didn't want to panic our people. I gave one of these talks back in, I think it was May, and there was a Ukrainian family there who was like, they were on the billing with me. It was really fascinating to hear their story. And somebody asked a question like, well, what do you think about Zelensky's leadership, particularly early in the war? And the wife said, we recognize that our government did some things wrong back then, but we're at war now, and we're going to back our government while we're at war. And then when the war's over, we'll go back and look at what happened and try to, figure out what we did wrong. But, like, we can't, this is not the time for recriminations. He's doing the best he can under these circumstances. So yeah, we propped him up. And just for my money, it seems like it's been a pretty good use of resources to keep him in power. And this actually ties back to the China thing. I mean, I think the thing that really worries the Chinese is the West actually has more resolve than they thought to support countries that have systems different from the Chinese or Russian systems. And of course, what the Chinese are thinking about is the government of Taiwan, which is actually a functioning two-party state where people, fight in parliament, disagree with one another. And the Chinese question, of course, I'm sure they're wargaming this all the time, is if we invade Taiwan, what will the West do? Well, the answer changed over the course of the last year. Does that get to what you wanted, Wayne?
Thank you. Thank you, Kirk.
And I have one question in chat that I was going to do, and then I'll let Dick ask his, because this one's been there a while. How long do you think the American public will continue to support Ukraine by the sending of additional weapons and other military resources?
That is in terms of American politics, and maybe even in terms of the whole war.
Yeah.
That's the central question, right? Because without American aid, I don't think the Europeans and Japanese can provide enough aid on their own. I also don't think that the Europeans will continue to provide aid for long if the United States has stopped doing it. So I think right now, the cost to the American people is so low. And because, I mean, let's face it, we have $1 trillion deficit every year, and we're not even batting an eye about that. What is $30 billion, in terms of the cost of the American people? So the cost isn't anything. The casualty count's very low, but I think it's important that President Biden continues to sell to the American people, probably more than he has, particularly now that the House is in Republican hands and the Republican Party is really split on this issue, to sell to the American people. And he's got to stand up with Mitch McConnell, and they've got to find a couple Republicans in the House who will speak together and say, this is not a partisan issue. This is about America's national interest going back to they should invoke Ronald Reagan every chance they get. I'm obviously speaking as somebody who thinks we should be doing more to support Ukraine, so people can disagree with me on that. But so I think it will last as long as the US government continues to make a case to the American people. This is a very small price to pay for a huge benefit to the system that we've supported since World War II. And that this is about, self-government. It is striking to me to see people who claim to be followers of Ronald Reagan, and they're saying, we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine. It's I'm pretty sure where Ronald Reagan would be in this case. He would be pouring the money into Ukraine if he were alive under these circumstances. So this is I think it's a fascinating thing. I think the Republican Party is up for grabs. And certainly if, any of the people I can see as potential nominees in the Republican Party are making it clear that they don't think a lot of support for Ukraine. So it could easily end in 2025. Now, I don't think the war will still be going in 2025, but historians are a lot better at the past than we are at the future.
Yeah.
Could I ask another question?
Yes, your turn, Dick. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, on the administration's policy of sanctions, and I would say gradualism over time to try and keep away from the worry of a nuclear attempt by the Russians. On the other hand, do you think the Chinese would get in there and basically not want the Russians to use a nuclear deterrent, and therefore perhaps we should be more aggressive in supplying F-16s and other weapons, certainly the long-range weapons. It's almost like this is like the Afghanistan-Pakistan situation where there was a safe haven for the enemy. And Russia has a safe haven because you can't attack it.
It's true, and it's a difficult position. I think you see a couple things there. First of all, I do think that the Chinese would pressure the Russians not to use a nuclear weapon. So I think Xi Jinping is incredibly optimistic about the future for China, right? But the future for China gets a lot worse if we get a nuclear exchange. Even if it's just 2 atom bombs, the world's going to be really different. And he thinks he's winning right now. So why would he risk destabilizing it? So I'm sure the Chinese have been leaning on the Russians to say, under no circumstances would you start a nuclear war, right? And the Russians are, I don't think the Russians are really thinking about that too seriously. I mean, if they were going to, they've had their opportunities where within their frame of mind, they could have justified it. So I don't think there's much risk of a nuclear strike, but I also think that the Biden administration and its allies have been pretty wise in cautiously ramping up what they've been giving to the Ukrainians. So a couple of things. One, and General Mark Hertling, who's really active on Twitter and has written a lot of very interesting things. I urge you to follow him because I think he's really smart about these things. One of the points he's been making is the more complex weapons we give them, the more time it takes to train people on these weapons. You don't just send them an M1 tank and say, good luck. As he said, you get a bad mechanic and the tank's gone for, until you get a new engine. So you really have to have all this training. And, the Ukrainians they're, for one thing, a lot of their soldiers are fighting. They don't have time to step away and train. They're sending some way, but let's train them on the basics first. And then, as they master those, we can slowly filter in more complex weapons that they will be able to handle. And I think certainly the F-16 gets to that point. I think the problem with giving them American fighters, so far, everything we've given them, except for a couple of missiles, basically have stayed on the battlefield in Ukraine. If we give them F-16s, it's only a matter of time before they start flying them into Russian airspace and blowing up Russian air bases. If they're flying old Soviet fighters into Russian airspace and blowing up Russian bases, that's their business. If they're flying F-16s that we gave them, then that's pushing the envelope. So I can understand the reluctance to let them have F-16s. I think that it may turn out that history will say that the United States was too cautious at this point. But I think the main thing that we have to worry about is an irrational act by Vladimir Putin. And, the sad thing is that we know that our reluctance is probably causing more civilian casualties or allowing more civilian casualties. The Russians are causing them. We're not causing them. But if we misstep and Putin panics and does something with a weapon of mass destruction, then we've got a whole different ballgame. So the Biden administration has been in a pretty tough position. And I've been impressed with the way they have handled that difficulty and also even the difficulty within NATO, because NATO has to be unanimous to get anything done, as does the EU, and the Hungarians are being really difficult. I don't know where the Hungarians were who were there in 1996 who wanted to get into the West, but they're all gone, or they've turned into Viktor Orbanites. So it's a real challenge to keep NATO focused. And I think, pushing F-16s into the battlefield prematurely is a big risk. And now one more thing I'll say about this. It seems to me that the things that are causing the most damage to civilians are these cruise missiles. And I haven't seen any evidence that an F-16 is going to be a weapon against a cruise missile. Maybe they can use them if they know when the cruise missiles are coming. But I don't know that that's going to solve those particular problems of random bombardments of civilians. So it's a really challenging situation they're in. And I'm sure historians 30 years from now will look back and say, boy, they misunderstood this and they got that wrong. But I'm also pretty confident that this is sort of like Lend-Lease in 1940-41. Winston Churchill called it the most unsorted act. It wasn't perfect, but it was an act it was risky because it risked a war with Germany, but it also kept Britain in the war and then eventually actually kept the Soviet Union in the war at relatively low cost.
Kirk, I have two more questions in the chat. Do you have time to take those?
Absolutely. I love having an audience. I have an audience.
Okay.
It's not
Right.
either asleep or on their cell phones like my students. So this is good.
The first one is, do you think the foreign aid that is being sent will be spent for defense and not end up in corrupt pockets?
It's interesting. Was it 3 weeks ago, maybe, there was this really public push in the Zelensky administration to cashier some people for corruption. And I thought that was fascinating because it struck me that what he was trying to do was to get ahead of the people in the United States who say the Ukrainian government is corrupt and we're just wasting money like we always do with foreign aid. And of course, we spend very little on foreign aid compared to what we spend everywhere else. But there's this image in the United States that foreign aid is like I think it was Jesse Helms who said, like flushing money down foreign rat holes. So that's a common belief. So I think, actually, what did I read just the other day? That was Mitch McConnell one of his aides was reported, it might have been in the Washington Post, that they've been working really hard with other people in the Senate and the House to show ways in which the Western military aid has been properly managed in Ukraine. Like they have the data and they're trying to convince the people who are arguing about Ukrainian corruption that this is not a problem. Now, we're talking billions of dollars. There's going to be corruption. There's corruption in the United States. We're talking about billions of dollars. So they're going to find stuff in Ukraine. But I think that in general, there's going to be very little that we're going to point to and say, wow, that was pretty bad. I think the West has tried really hard. And I think Zelensky recognizes that the worst thing that could happen to him right now is a huge scandal showing that the Ukrainians have frittered away dollars right when the Republicans in the House are saying, why are we doing this? That's only going to swing people into their picture. So I think we're going to find that there's not much corruption, but there will always be some.
Right. Thank you. And then the other one is, this may be slightly off topic, but how do you feel the efforts of the Nordic countries to want to join NATO can influence the Ukrainian situation?
This is just the remarkable thing. I have a colleague who's from Sweden, and it must have been last March when I first heard some rumblings that Sweden was going to join NATO. And so I said to Fred, I said, oh, so I hear that Sweden's going to join NATO. And he said, never, Sweden's never going to join NATO. That's ridiculous. He said, don't believe you hear that. I said, oh, all right. So he's from Sweden. He would know. And then 3 months later, I said, hey, Fred, Sweden just announced they're going to join NATO. So I don't know what's happening. He said, what's happened to my country? He wasn't upset about it. He understood why Sweden was joining NATO. But I don't know that it's going to change the situation in Ukraine. Well, I'd say two things. One is it will help Ukraine in that it's two more voices when they eventually get into NATO, which of course is being held up by the Turks. So they're not in NATO yet. That will be in very strongly anti-Russian voices, right? Because there are a lot of people further west in Europe are like, well, Russia sells us oil and gas, and who cares if Putin's a jerk in his own country, because that's his problem, not ours. The Finns are like, no. We remember 1939 when Russia invaded us. And Swedes are like, yeah, we keep seeing Russian submarines in our harbors. This is a real threat. So I think the Finns and the Swedes will make NATO more anti-Russian than it would have been. And of course, that's the amazing thing about how Putin's miscalculations. Apparently nobody said to him, this invasion might force two neutrals out of their neutral status into NATO, which clearly he wouldn't have wanted. So I don't think it's going to change the situation in Ukraine very much, because I think Sweden and Finland have already been supplying weapons for Ukraine. They already consider themselves allies. But I think it's more the symbolic defeat of Russian foreign policy. You might be muted, Susan. Or am I just having no sound?
No.
If anybody has any questions, they can just speak out or raise your hand or put them in the chat and I can read them.
I did see a question about, I thought there was one about organizations that could help. And let's see if I can put a few up here. Sorry.
Okay.
So we had a scholar of Ukraine who was here talking about something different, but she recommended the Razum for Ukraine organization as a possibility if people are interested. And then Scott Kelly, the astronaut whose brother is a senator, he has been raising money for ambulances for Ukraine. So I think both of those are good. I have put money into Scott Kelly's organization. I haven't actually done Razum for Ukraine. And then there's just this one that is I personally know about. Olivia Babin, it works at the university. She's the administrator for the Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department. It was her sister who was speaking at the organization that I went to in May in Madbury. So Olivia's brothers still live in Kyiv, and they're ministers. And so they didn't want to leave the city. They were trying to help Ukrainian people who were trying to flee from the Russian advance to get into the cities. They had borrowed a friend's van to go pick up some people who were in the path of the Russian army and bring them back to Kyiv. And their van got hit by an artillery shell. Remarkably, the shrapnel went through the van, through their clothes. She showed me a picture of her brother's jacket, which was sliced basically at half at the arm. Nobody was killed, but the van was basically destroyed. So she's been for most of the last year trying to raise money to help them buy a new van. I don't know what the status of it is. So you might want to check it. I must admit I didn't check it beforehand. This is I had this from an earlier talk, but it'd be worth looking for Olivia Babin's GoFundMe if you wanted to help. I've also given to the Catholic Charities organizations. I think they do incredible work with relatively low overhead. There's even you can also Google and find there's a Canadian organization. My sons encouraged me to give money to last year. I'm trying to see if I can remember it, but basically it's to help the veterinarians of Ukraine take care of all the stray animals because of course a lot of families had to leave their animals behind or they were killed and their dogs were left behind. And so Ukrainian veterinarians have had this just horrible backlog of injured and lost animals they've been taking care of. And there's a Canadian, if you just Google Ukrainian stray dogs or something like that, we found it at Christmas time. So my sons persuaded me that it was a good thing, and so they were in the giving mood. So we thought we'd give them some money. So there are plenty of opportunities. Yes.
Can I ask another question?
I'm always happy to take questions.
Yeah, on NATO and its being a collection of democratic countries, and then as they've expanded, we've gotten Turkey in there, we've gotten Hungary in there, and Italy is even not supporting the Ukrainian war. I mean, what do you see as the future of NATO as it expands and more right-wing governments come into power?
So actually, I think the Italian government has been pretty, even the new sort of sons of fascists that they've taken over the Italian government have been pretty supportive of Ukraine. I was just reading again, I mentioned David Frum earlier. He had a link in one of his Twitter feeds about I think it's Merloni, I think is the new prime minister, that she's actually been pretty supportive of Ukraine. So that's a good sign, although I don't know enough about Italian politics to know how that government will turn out, except to know that Italian prime ministers don't last very long anyway. So, I wouldn't worry about that too much. Hungary was a vibrant democracy when we invited it to join, or we let them join. I was in Hungary in 2011 with an exchange program. There were three parties fighting it out: Jobbik, which was the far right party, and Fidesz, which was Orban's party, which seemed like sort of a center right party, and then the socialists who could never get away from the way they bungled the transition out of the communist system. So Orban's transition to being this autocrat was not obvious until the last few years. I mean, 2011, he seemed like the moderate voice of Hungarian politics who was keeping it on the democratic straight. So, and as for Turkey, we let Turkey into NATO in 1952 as a counterweight to the Russians, not because it was a democracy. And the whole Erdogan situation has been a nightmare for the United States and really the European Union to try to figure out how to respond to Erdogan. And of course, he's using his veto to keep Finland and Sweden out, because Finland and Sweden have given homes to the Kurds who were fighting the Turks. The Turks call them terrorists. The Finns and Swedes call them victims. So there's a deadlock there. I mean, this is one of the problems when an organization gets big and requires unanimity, is that it's easy for one person to block it. I think if you were to go back 2 or 3 years, there would have been a lot of talk, or even a year and a half, of like, what really is NATO's purpose? Like, we sort of failed in Afghanistan, even though Article 5 was invoked for Afghanistan. And, is the Russian army really a threat? That's why so many of the NATO members weren't paying the 2% into the defense spending that they were supposed to be doing. They didn't really see a threat. I think NATO is not going away in my lifetime. I'm 57. I'm planning on being here for another, 2-3 years. Maybe I'll live. My dad's 91, so I'll try to match him. I don't think NATO's going away anytime soon, because this Russian threat is reminding people that, even if Russia loses this war in any organized sense, it's a massive country with nuclear weapons, a whole lot of physicists, a lot of oil and gold and other raw materials. Russia is not going to go away as a powerful country. And I think it would be foolish to think that Russia is going to be pro-Western in any organized sense. I mean, if anything, the lesson from Viktor Orban is that a country might start down the road to being, democratic and not wanting to fight its neighbors, and then take a turn in the wrong direction because an election goes differently than it might, and suddenly you've got a guy in Orban who controls basically the entire government. So I suspect that there will be a lot of realists in power across Europe who are thinking, yeah, we're not going to make this mistake about Russia again. Russia is not going away anytime soon.
I have one more question in the chat, which sort of speaks to a question earlier, but this is more in regards to Europe. Do you think Europe will stay united in regards to sanctions against Russia? Inflation is very high and energy prices have exploded.
I think Europe will stay about as united as Europe can be. I'm reminded of Will Rogers' old line where he said, "I'm not a member of an organized party, I'm a Democrat." And I think it's sort of like the same thing with Europe. Like I'm not really a member of a continent, I'm a European. Like it's just there. I mean, how do you say there's unity between Finland, Hungary, and Portugal, right? They've got such different interests. Having said that, I think that one of the things they've learned over the last year and a half, is that being dependent on Russian gas is really bad. And that they will have survived this winter and some of last winter without a lot of Russian gas. Obviously, the Russians are still selling fuel into the Western world, but the Europeans are moving further and further away from that. So put that on the tally sheet of things that Putin got wrong, is I think he thought that his energy was so valuable that the Europeans would cave, and they haven't. So they've survived the worst of the threat, as I see it. The fact that the German government even decided to take some of its nuclear power plants off the mothball list and keep them going, even though with the Greens and the government, is pretty remarkable. So I think European unity, I think, again, what Putin did, and Finland and Sweden are examples of this, is created a unity that was fading fast. Brexit, right? And was there going to be a Greek exit? And is Hungary going to get out of the EU? And really, what is the point of the EU at some level? Well, there's nothing like the Ukrainians saying, we would love to be in the EU and we're willing to fight for the right to keep the Russians out, so you'll take us into the EU. Please do it right away. Just at some level to remind people how good it is to be in the EU, and that's a lot better than the first half of the 20th century in Europe. And so, I think people sometimes get complacent and they forget what they have. I think about, a certain representative who declared that maybe parts of the United States should secede. Somebody forgot what 1861 to 1865 looks like if you're going to talk about secession. So under these circumstances, I think what the Russian war has done is reminded Europeans that European unity is really valuable and not to be taken for granted, and that it's worth a lot. I'm confident if Brexit had not happened before, and they were debating Brexit now, Brexit would get slaughtered in the British polls, right? Because the value of being united to Britain. In fact, I think if they could do a do-over, Britain would overwhelmingly vote to get back into the European Union, but that I'm not sure the European Union would take them back right now. Maybe they'd make Boris Johnson get a haircut before they think about letting him back in. But it seems to me that the European Union is going to be strong, for the foreseeable future. There will always be cracks, but nothing like what there might have been had this war not happened.
Okay, well, there are no more questions in the chat. If anyone has a question, speak up. If not, I'll say thank you to Kurk. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. The whole history, your opinions about it, it was fascinating. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy talking to an audience with great questions. And I'm always happy to talk foreign policy with people who are knowledgeable and interested. So this is great. I enjoy doing it. I teach these classes every year. And it's just, I teach at 8 in the morning and I have all these students who have questions about, I never get through my lectures any day because they're like, what about this? What about that? And I just love it because, I like people being interested. I'm sorry it took a war to get some people interested, but it's very good that we are paying attention. And I hope it reminds us to appreciate what a peaceful world is like and what it's worth doing to keep it intact.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank everybody for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Kurk.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Susie.
Okay.
Yep.